Ann Betz to the podcast WORKLiberated. Thank you for being our guest. This podcast is about reinventing what it is to work in the modern world. And the whole premise is liberation. So my company and my personal vision is to forever liberate the human spirit at work, whether it means in your own business, working for someone else, or doing whatever you do. So tell us a little bit about you, Ann.
Oh my gosh. Well, I love the whole concept of the podcast. So I'm thrilled to be here and thanks for having me. So I am the co-founder of a company called BEabove Leadership. We focus on the intersection of neuroscience, consciousness, or human effectiveness at the individual, interpersonal, and group level. And then we also do a lot of training for advanced coaches, people in the coaching field who want to learn about how to bring neuroscience to their programs. And so that's my love. It's my business for 18 years. And then I also have the other thing we do in my business and part of my side expertise, in addition to neuroscience, is I have an expertise on toxic personalities, both interpersonally and in the workplace. So
toxicity is the talk of the time.
Absolutely.
People are, the advertisers will have you think the Great Resignation is happening because people want to make more money or because they have a bad manager. It's a lot more than that. So we'll talk about that today too.
Makes sense.
So Ann, you and I know each other because I was one of those coaches who wanted to bring neuroscience and expertise to myself and to Keen Alignment. Yep. And tell us a little bit about how you decided or when you decided that you wanted to go from teaching coaches to having an expertise in neuroscience. Why was that important to you?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And it kind of, I think, links to this whole resonant work conversation that, you're having on this podcast. Because one of the things that I have started telling people based on my own experience, when they want to know, like, where should I go and what direction should I go in and how should I differentiate myself? One of the things I say is listen to the question that won't leave you alone. And the question that wouldn't leave me alone about 12 years ago was this whole idea of human effectiveness. And we were working with a model. It's called the 7 levels of effectiveness. And at the time, my joke about it, Maji, is we had this great model, but we couldn't get arrested. Like nobody was listening to it. And maybe that was just we weren't that good at marketing. But I think part of it was that it wasn't grounded in anything other than, sort of research actually on consciousness, but it wasn't grounded in more mainstream research. So I started seeing mainstream research kind of come through my feed, stuff about neuroscience. And I think this relates to what we're talking about, but I don't understand it. I really don't. So that was the question that just kept, I just kept getting poked by this thought, you should go study neuroscience. And then I'd be like, shut up. And then it would be like, you should go and I'd be like, I'm not smart enough. I can't do that until I finally just said, I surrender. Obviously, this is a big question, and obviously I'm going to have to go see if I can do it. And that's what sent me there. And then the later part of the story was I didn't go there thinking we were going to train coaches in neuroscience. I went there trying to figure out how are humans more or less effective in life, and is there brain patterning that correlates with that? But when I got into the programs, a couple of different programs that I took, what I started seeing was there is all this validation for coaching that nobody knows about. Mm-hmm. Be like, oh, this technique that is, super common in coaching, like reflecting on your values, is scientifically proven in a clinical way to reduce the biochemical markers of stress. And I'm like, how come no one in the coaching world knows this? And so that's what kind of drew me over there. That was a long answer.
So I think you already know this, but at Keen Alignment, everything we do weaves the 7 levels of individual, group, and organizational effectiveness because we focus on culture. But what I find so interesting is all the companies that focus on culture And it's like a thing that they do, like, we're going to do values and you're going to follow these values, and we're going to do behaviors and this is our vision. But they don't understand how to tap into the hearts and heads, the mind, science, the brain of the people working there to make sure that people can actually take in whatever that mission, vision, and values is and operate congruently with that. Because what they're not looking at is all the markers of stress that are already in people's way. The understaffed, the overwork, the lack of acknowledgement, the lack of understanding what people really want to do. And so what I love about your work and Ursula's work is that if you're going to do it and if you're going to get certified, you can't coach people and you can't get people where they want to go without being responsible for how their chemistry is changing when they're doing the work.
I think that's so well said. And I know, and I love that Keen Alignment has found this resonant. I mean, that was part of our hope in being able to marry this model of consciousness to neuroscience and coaching and organizational work. So I always, I love hearing your stories because you're out there doing it in the world in, places that I'm not. So I love that. I think there's a number of things that are so cool in what you're saying. One is that companies, you're so right, companies would be like, here's our values. And they're not bad values, right? Often they're really good. But it's if you try to just lay them on people, one of the things that happens is you're not taking into account, as you so well said, the context that they're operating in and whether their brains even have a moment to go, oh yeah, good values. And the other thing about it, and this one I think is really important as well, is that it's part of why coaching works. And I think this, Maji, but the difference between just telling someone what to do, giving advice, versus activating within them a process where they reflect on who they are, what they want, and therefore how to move forward. And even if you end up at the same place, even if you as the coach is sitting there going, there's a part of me that kind of knows what this person should do. But we know as coaches, we have to tell that part of ourselves to shut up first of all, they may have a very different idea. That's totally valid. But also they need the process. Without the process, the brain is not engaged in a way that carries through and stays motivated. And you need to actually activate. It's right in here. It's called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. It's right here. And that gets activated when people personally reflect. And that's what keeps them going and has them, for example, take a company's values as their own. You can't just order values because you haven't engaged the right parts of the brain.
So a couple things. First of all, we're talking about consciousness in the same sentence that we're talking about work liberated. So what does consciousness, I have a two-part question. First of all, the second part is, what does consciousness have to do with being liberated at work or having work be liberated? So we'll start there and then I'll ask the other one.
Okay. Just a little question. That's all. Okay. What does consciousness have to do with having work be liberated? Well, one of the things, it's the big question. So we talk about consciousness and, a number of years ago, people in the field of philosophy, I can't remember who it was, but it was a famous paper where this guy basically said, we're all talking about consciousness, but nobody's really said what it is. So it's kind of so if you and I were to have an operating definition of this is why we often refer to consciousness as effectiveness. And if I were to do a little, just very simple definition of what do I mean by effectiveness, greater degrees of effectiveness, what I would say is less effort, more results. And longer lasting results. So you can, through screaming and shouting and threatening and all sorts of reinforcement, you can get your 4-year-old to do anything eventually, right? But first of all, you kill their spirit, and secondly, they might not do it when you're not there. much better to go the slightly slower route, to work with your 4-year-old to learn good, to learn to talk about their emotions and to learn to say how they're feeling and all of that, and learn how to, calm themselves down rather than just throwing a tantrum. So I think about less effort, more results, longer lasting results. Might seem like slightly more effort at the time, but what's going to happen is you're going to have a young adult who's a wonderful kid and, volunteering and things like that. Same in work liberated and in the workplace. So I can make that connection. So if I do the work on myself to be more aware of my reactive tendencies, and do the hard work to be patient, identify how I'm feeling, have a difficult conversation, maybe would come to you if you're my boss and, maybe I'm not used to this because my parents didn't train me that it was okay to say how I feel, and say, Maji, when you asked me to do this, I noticed that I don't, respond in a positive way. And, can you help me with that? If I can do that, we're going to have ultimately a much more liberated relationship. And it may seem harder and more painful in the moment, but in the long term, obviously so much more effective for everybody involved, including me, because if I can learn that talking to you, and I don't have to just react and fly off the handle, but I can have a conscious, collaborative conversation with you, then the next time I have to do it, I'm not so gripped by fear. And I think it's the F word that really is the huge part of work liberation, right?
Yeah. So when I think of consciousness, I think aware and awake to what is. Mm-hmm. Not what we think is, not what our past tells us is, but what really is going on in the moment. Mm-hmm. So I'm writing a book. I don't know if you knew this, but
I didn't know that.
It's called Ignite Culture. And it really is about neuroscience. The whole beginning is that culture begins with the chief executive officer doing his or her work internally. So it's about cultural transformation from the inside out. And the work we do, it takes longer. You got to slow down to get there faster. But our clients experience massive results, 30% better results than they do when they're using some kind of app that helps you with culture. Right. Because when you do the work to connect the brain synapses, is that how you say it, Ann?
Yeah, it works for me.
and when we're connecting and we're slowing down our response time, we actually can be mindful or aware of how we react. So anyway, in the research for the book, we talk about consciousness and being awake and being responsible for our impact. And guess what percentage in our research we found out of the world's population that are considered to be conscious or awake and aware of their responses, their behavior, and their impact on others? Out of 0 to 100%, guess how many percentage of people are considered to be conscious?
I love that somebody did this research, Maji, because it's a really good question. I would say probably varies greatly geographically, but man, it's not a lot, right? What is the actual number?
It's 15% of the world.
It doesn't surprise it, given what I see in organizations and in the world and in the, just way people respond and in day-to-day life and even driving on the highway, it does not surprise me. And so, haranguing people in to be, get on the team and get on the bus and stuff like that, you got to help them become more awake and aware. And I think where these really dovetail, and I love what you're saying, I love your definition of consciousness, because that is what makes somebody more effective. You're awake, you're aware of your impact. If you're not aware of it, you cannot, in the words of one of my teachers, modify and moderate.
Yeah.
And because you're just going along and something happens and you don't get what you want. If you're not aware of your own impact and your own role in that, then it's just blame the organization, blame the other person, rather than saying, maybe I was a little abrupt. And I have a story because I think this is a lifelong process. So can I tell you a little story?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a good one. So I noticed that I was getting irritated with my partner because he has this way of getting a plan in mind, and he's like 3 miles down the road before I've even kind of gone, do I even want to do that? Like, and it could be little stuff like having a party. And I noticed we were out to dinner and we were talking, he was talking about this party and this and that. And I noticed I'm just disconnected because back to what we were talking about earlier, I never had it. I didn't process it in my own brain. Now he has great ideas. He's a really good cook, but I'm just noticing that my response is, I don't care. And so I'm thinking about this and I'm sitting with it because I don't just want to yell at him, right? Because that wouldn't be awake and aware. But I'm noticing like, why am I pissed when he's just talking about tacos? Like, why am I so annoyed? Here's the realization. I went, oh, it's because I wasn't involved and I need to get my head into it in order to get excited about it and committed to it. And then the next realization was, oh, I do this to my business partner.
That's great.
I went, oh my God. And I called her and I said, I think I do this thing. Do I do this thing? I get an idea in my head and I'm off down the road and I've written up the proposal and I've got it all written before she's had a chance to really play. And she said, thank you so much for mentioning it. Yes, you do that to me. And, and I said, what's the impact? And she said, I disengage. I think, why do you even need me? And I thought, wow.
So that's what that brings up is this whole liberating structure. So we use 7 levels. We also use this methodology called liberating structures. And in all of our retreats, in all of the work we do in creating mission, vision, values, in taking it to the streets so every level of employee can digest these values, we do it through liberating structures, which are really getting engagement and involvement from each person in the system, so that they become theirs. Yeah. And I think when you've got these personalities like you and I have, and like many other business leaders have, we see the end. And like your significant other, we're having a party, we're having tacos, we're going. And
it'll be fun.
All have to really stop and say, does everybody even know what we're doing? Is everybody on board with what we're doing? Because if they're not, they become sand in the gears.
Yeah.
And often that hurry up, let's do it now, immediately now, they'll bypass good, well-meaning people who might take longer to get things done. So they'll bypass them and take away their power, or the people let their power get taken away. Yeah. And then they don't feel liberated, they feel disconnected. And
absolutely. And I think that, and I think like you're saying, often I think this might be a curse of a visionary leader who can, and also, who has that particular skill. I'm not like a super visionary. I have no idea what's going to happen in 7 years, but I have a skill of being able to have an idea and see the steps. And when you have that skill, it's easy. And apparently my partner has my life partner, as well as my business partner, has that skill, and not realizing, when I talked to him about it, he said, I thought I was basically doing you a favor. And I kind of had the same thought with my business partner, like, oh, no big deal. I'll figure all this out. And what we're not thinking about is, where are we, the research on, some of the research on dopamine, which is a big part of the reward circuit. I know, and what you'll find is, the dopamine hit, the spike, if you're measuring it, comes before the activity has happened. And so, the joke is that most people have more fun planning a vacation than they do on vacation, because that's where you're getting the dopamine. And so it's in the planning of whatever it is, the taco party or the, leadership retreat that we're doing, business or pleasure. It's in the planning that the brain is making new connections. It's thinking about things. It's thinking about possibility. That is actually the more rewarding part. And I think visionary leaders and like that, they sort of think, no, I'm just going to create this for everybody, not realizing that they're ripping them off of the fun part.
Yeah. Well, and it's disengaging. So I want to talk about the Great Resignation.
Yeah, for sure.
In your work, you work with thousands of coaches. You coach coaches to use this kind of methodology when they're coaching. And so I know you're very abreast of what's happening with the Great Resignation. What would you say? What do you have to say about the Great Resignation?
Oh my gosh, I think you're probably way more up on that than I do. I mean, I think there must be so many factors ranging from the way millennials and Gen Z sees the workplace to what happened during COVID of people kind of having this time, that they maybe didn't have, where their brains were able to do some reflection on, what do I want? What do I value? What's important to me? I think that's part of it. I hope that it is a calibration toward people saying, I deserve to have meaningful work in my life.
Yeah.
I also think one of the trends that I know a little more about is the trend of, something that's been happening, and it's been very much like in the last 3 years, it's not the same as the Me Too movement, but it's somewhat similar like that. And we can look at all of the toxic workplaces and cults and things like that, and the whole bloom of people understanding narcissistic abuse and coercive control and things like that has just it has totally taken off in the last 3 years. And I do think there may be something in the Great Resignation where people are starting to realize, I don't want to be treated like this. And I won't be treated like this. And life is too short to work for someone who's insulting me or, harassing me or whatever it is. So off I go. So that's the part that I know a little more about than some of the other factors, I think, Maji.
Yeah, I think so. So when I look at meaningful work, so there's the toxic, which we'll get into, and then there's the meaningful work. I don't want to just push the paper.
Right.
And I'm hearing a lot about, I don't want to do mindless work that could be offshored. I want to do something where I'm using my whole brain and my heart and my gut and my soul. Yeah. And I want self-actualization now. So tell me about the part of the brain in the 7 levels, or what level that would be, where I get to be self-actualized at work, and why that's so important to people.
Yeah, well, it's I'm a sort of I don't know why. It's a really good question. It may be that some of what we're looking at is Maslow's hierarchy, which he never meant apparently as a total hierarchy. And we look at it as this chunk has to be in place. You have to have safety and security and shelter, and then you can have this. And he never meant it quite that linear way. But to a certain degree, the truth that when there are certain basic needs in place, the mind naturally goes to this question of, what is my life for? Mm. And I also think that, you and I come out of the self-help movement, deeply, deeply for most of our lives. Since I was 18 years old, I have been involved with various methods of looking at what is a meaningful life. And this is very much of our times. We're this almost the same age, a little bit younger than me. I'm 58. And so, looking at from the late 70s, early 80s to today, the last 40 years, what we've seen is just like a mushrooming of self-help programs, books, human potential movement, and it's become more mainstream. There's also a lot of nonsense in it, and there's also a fair amount of abuse in it. That's a conversation that goes back to the toxic thing. But on the plus side, there's been a more public conversation that said life should have meaning, which I think is really different than like my grandmother's life, right? So I think it's kind of a sign of the times.
Yeah, but the only problem is the human beings have evolved and saying, I want purpose and meaning or self-actualization. But the employers are like, you should be lucky to have a job. I'm paying you benefits. I gave you a cost of living increase.
Right.
It's I almost think if they put the decision-making in the hands of the people who wanted self-actualization, most of the business problems would be solved in a very, very short period of time.
I think
it's like this executive team has to be in charge of all these decisions when they don't even know what's really happening. And that command and control squashes people.
Right. And it's run by, and you're shaking as you do, because I think that's totally appropriate, because it is fueled by a fundamental fear. It's fueled by quarterly earnings reports. It's fueled by this sort of whole way. I always tell this story that years and years ago, I worked in a corporation. And at the time we had a little department that was corporate social responsibility. And this would have been in the early 90s. And that's all they did. They just looked at how their corporation should be responsible. And then at some point, about 1993, 94, that department marketing went, hey, we should be using that, because before that they were separate. They were just about being, and the ethic behind corporate social responsibility originally was, we use the resources of our community. We should give back to the community. And there was something very clean about it. Marketing took over. And I saw in this organization, then the lens was not what does the community need? The lens was, where do we get our name out? What's good for us, not what's good for the community. And I think there's something about I think that has the self-serving nature of corporations is part of what makes people feel disconnected from meaning and purpose as well. It's interesting that I go back to the past to say there was a time, and that may have been very regional. I was in Minneapolis at the time, and we had some very strong corporate leaders. The head of the Dayton Hudson Corporation, which later became Target, he was a staunch supporter of this. And so it might have been very regional that's how they saw it. But I think this feeling like at some point, the organization I'm working for is only in it for itself, it kills something in people, in what we really want as human beings.
So that brings up this whole B Corp and conscious capitalism. Are you familiar with either?
A little bit, not deep into it by any means.
Well, the theory behind B Corp is very similar than conscious capitalism, and that is the reason we're in business is to serve. And yes, we got to make money, because if we don't make money, we can't pay people. But it's how are we impacting our stakeholders, not shareholders, but stakeholders, which means our employees, our community, the families of our employees, and are we being responsible with the environment and with how we're spending money and who we're serving? And so it's just this greater awareness. But I'm really surprised that conscious capitalism has not taken on more.
I think there was a belief, because I love that. And I think that kind of loops back to this sort of, little golden era in Minneapolis, where all of the big companies were, it was actually one of the Daytons who was like, you should be giving away 1% of your income every year. And like people were signing up for it because of his leadership. It was pretty cool. So it kind of goes back to that kind of ethic. I think and again, I believe I'm preaching to the choir telling you this, but I think there's a false belief, and it's fear-based false belief that if we somehow let go of this control focused thing, it's all going to go to hell in a handbasket, and everybody will be, no one will do any work.
It'll be a free-for-all.
It'll be a free-for-all. And what's interesting is one of the things that we saw during COVID was you give people freedom, and they worked really hard. You gave them the freedom to be home, and, they worked hard. And I remember our local gas company during COVID had a little recording when I had to call to switch over my gas. And they were like, our employees are working from home. So if you hear a baby crying or a dog barking, please have patience with it. And I'm like, I love to hear a baby crying and a dog barking. It's human.
Yeah.
So I think there's this false belief that you have to like, no babies crying, no dogs barking, none of that, because you won't get your work done. Rather than the truth is people work harder when they can be a whole person and have a baby and have a dog and
have a life.
So
I want to ask you, because we've talked about it, and this is a podcast, and there's people who never have heard of me or you that are going to be watching and listening. Briefly, can you give us an overview of the 7 levels of individual, group, and organizational effectiveness, and why they're so important for people to be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's on our website, which we can put in the notes, but also it's BEabove, like BEabove leadership.com. And if you go to the 7 levels, you can get the full description. But it really maybe the best way to talk about it is a very brief history, not long, but it came out of originally this had to do with a lot of things I was reading at the time. And this is almost 20 years ago. But I remember a friend of mine calling me, and he was really angry at something that was happening politically. I lived in St. Paul, and something was happening in education politically. And he couldn't understand why people were acting a certain way and in such what he felt was a very destructive way. And it was one of those times where everything that I'd been reading, like kind of just came in, and I'd been reading a lot of Neil Donald Walsh at the time, who wrote The Conversations with God. And he talked a lot about love and fear, as do many other people. So it's not the originator. Who the heck knows who the Buddha, maybe. So anybody takes credit for that, they're probably wrong. It's not Marianne Williamson. It's not Jill, but at any rate. And I just went, oh, I get it. They're making these decisions. They're passing these laws. They're asking for this education tactics because they're afraid. It's fear. It's love or fear. I get why people do what they do. I get it. They're operating out of love or they're operating out of fear. And so I called Ursula, who's been my business partner for 20 years and is my, best friend in the world and my co-creator. And I called her and I said, I just had this hit, and she loved it. And she said, let's make this into something organizationally. And she said this great thing. It's a little awkward in the way she phrased it, but I still love it. She said, yes. And who you are being are the results you are getting. Absolutely. You come from love, you get love. Sometimes it's more long-term. So we started doing some work in organizations, and we did this fun thing where we had this organization that we knew that allowed us to come in and do a brown bag, right? This is the very first organizational development thing we did. And we said, think of a project that you had that went really well. Tell us, what was your attitude and what was your beliefs and how did you operate with each other? And we just grabbed a bunch of words, and they were 90%, what I would say, in the field of love, possibility, openness, 10% that weren't as great, right? Because humans are humans. And then we flipped it and we said, think of a project that you had that just tanked. Who were you being? How are you approaching it? Who you're being is a little weird, but it's like, how are you coming at it? What were you thinking? How are you interacting with each other? And I swear to you, the percentages were totally flipped. 90% in the field of fear, 10% in anything. In our words, we call it below the line and above the line. So where the 7 levels came in is we were like, okay, we're on to something. This seems like it could be really helpful in organizations, but it's not subtle enough. Everything that we might put sort of in the general bucket of fear is not the same. Anger is different than sadness. They might all be maybe less effective, but what is this? And the same is true above the line. And so we did some further research and looked into some other things. We looked into people like David Hawkins and Ken Wilber and Margaret Wheatley, and they've been some of our big influences. And we then worked with saying, let's look at these in terms of what are 7 different expanding, and inclusive levels, 3 of which would be, we would call below the line, and that's hopelessness, fear, and frustration, where if you're coming from there, you're going to be more likely to get those results you don't want. You might get short-term results. You're not going to get long-term results.
Well, and it's contagious. Those emotions and ways of being and ways of thinking are contagious, and they
absolutely
cancer. They metastasize.
Absolutely. And then, so you have these contagious below the line, ineffective fields, and then you have courage, engagement, innovation, and synchronicity increasingly and in an inclusive way, more effective. And then, as I said, sort of at the beginning, then about 12 years ago, I started, particularly, I'm the researcher in the family. And so I started really looking at, are there neural brain body correlates as we look at these 7 levels? And we've definitely found them. We've definitely found research that would correlate with this idea of why this is more effective or less effective, even to the state. And it's the thing that we say is we honor all levels. So it's not that don't be in fear and only, stupid people are in fear. We're all I'm in fear, multiple times during the day.
Yesterday when I got rescued by a handsome.
Right. I mean, we're like,
I should not have been in fear. I should have been in engagement.
Should have been in engagement, Yeah. So fear, it's just a normal human experience. And so we don't denigrate it. We don't, make it bad. It's more a question of how you work with it. And are you living there? Are you operating from it? Can you honor and include it? Can you learn what its lesson is?
So let me ask you a question. In the world of work liberated, tell us briefly what happens, even though we want to accept ourselves no matter what level we're in. But here's what I know from my work. Wherever you stay long enough or too long, it becomes habituated and it becomes who you become. And you're like, if you're a scaredy cat all the time, pretty soon you live in fear. Now you've got this personality in fear. I'd like to have our listeners and our watchers understand the impacts and what happens to the chemicals when we are below the line for too long.
Yeah. Well, I think it's, so there's a biochemical state. So that is designed to keep us alive. So it's not it's not bad. It's like, I always give the example of if your kid runs out in front of a car, you want to be in a state of what we know as fight, flight, you don't want to be in freeze. You want to be more what we would think of as reactive. You want to move, and everything is designed to help you shut down, sort of critical thinking and things like that. Because it's like, you don't want to go, I wonder how fast the car is going. I gotta go right now. So fear it's part of fear, anger, even sadness, they all have a role. When we don't have resilience and an ability to really look at what's possible in a grounded way. I'm not talking about a stupid way. I'm not talking about you took one coaching class and now you're going to quit your job. No, don't. Please don't. Ann said so. No. But being able to say there's a difference between sort of irrational optimism and being able to say, you know what, I'll give you an example of coaching. It's what I know the best. And I find it a very liberating career. So work liberated. Go to a coaching class, you think, oh my gosh, I want to do this. This has meaning. This has purpose. I think I might be good at it. Let me take some more classes. Maybe I will see if I can go to a 4-day week at work. And on the other day, I'll, work on my coaching business. And maybe at some point I'll go part-time, or maybe I'll find a platform that can bring me some clients. And then at some point I say to myself, okay, I'm afraid. I've never worked for myself before. I'm a little afraid, but you know what? I have 6 clients. I'm working for this coaching platform. Somebody else is wanting to bring me in on a regular basis. I've got my bills covered. I'm going to do it. And that's that where you have to step into fear, but it's calibrated.
Well, that's your prefrontal cortex has to be on in order to think that way.
Right.
What happens? What are the chemicals in our body that hijack us?
Yeah.
We're in frustration, fear, and hopelessness.
It probably slightly different depending on where you are. But one of the things that happens is this part of your brain, which is we tend to think of it as executive function, where you're able to think more abstractly and things like that. It gets flooded with adrenaline, norepinephrine in specific in the brain. It can get flooded with dopamine. You can have an imbalance of serotonin, things like that, so that you are not able to think as clearly. And this is why I say to people, don't take one coaching class and quit your job, because you might be high off of the possibility, but then you're going to get out there and the bills are going to come in, and do it if you want to. If you've got, if you're independently wealthy, have fun. But if you're not, and you don't have a way to pay your bills, there is the benefit of a little bit of pressure, but too much can take you to a place where you can't even think clearly.
And you're in panic.
Not smart.
So when you're above the line, when you have taken those 6 clients and you see a space and you can have more, and you're ready to take the risk, and you're courageous, or in engagement or in innovation or synchronicity, which are the other levels, what different kind of chemicals or hormones or what's going on in the brain when we're there?
Yeah, well, it's a number of different things. So one of the things would be is that in order to go to the more above the line levels that we've been talking about, and just for you to know, it looks a little like this. We have the below the line, and then we cross over. These are backwards, but courage, engagement, et cetera. In order to go to a more effective place, it really does require that one thing. There's a number of others, because nothing is simple in the brain, ain't one thing. But one thing that does seem to be really critical is that this part of our brain needs to be stimulated, but not stressed. So we need to be engaged. Back to what we were talking about before. We need things to have meaning to us personally, and be kind of stimulated by that, and maybe a tiny bit scared, because that actually brings in some chemicals. But if there's too many and you're looking at, oh my God, I have one client and I have a $3,000 mortgage payment coming up. Holy shit, that may take you way over to you can't see anything possible. So that's one aspect that's needed. The other thing the other factors that seem to be really critical for being in a higher state of effectiveness are things like, are you able to hear messages from your body and not be overwhelmed by them, but listen to and pay attention to? Because that's going to be a huge aspect of your intuition. It's going to guide you. It's going to kind of tell you when you've had too much and you need to back off a little bit. And then what's happening in certain other areas that take probably way too long to go into, but like, are you able to balance the big picture view of your right hemisphere with the more detailed view of your left hemisphere? And what I see with people who are not able to consistently bring themselves above the line is there will be something off in one of these areas that we call areas of integration. Yeah. And so if I'm working in an organization with an individual, what I'm going to be working with them on is helping them, use all of their being, including their body.
Yeah. Yeah. I just did a great program called the Hoffman process. I don't know if you've ever heard it.
Yep. My ex-husband did it. Yeah. Which it's not, actually, if he had kept going with it, we'd probably still be married. So, because it was really transformational. It was so good.
Is they take the intellect, the emotions, the spiritual self, and the body, and they have you self-regulate throughout the entire week. It's very powerful. So I know we wanted to talk about the opposite of liberation, or the what happens when you're in an organization or you're working with toxic personalities, whether they're the boss or coworkers. Let's talk about this. It's what seems to be rampant toxic personalities running companies and working for companies, and they don't know they're toxic. What is going on?
Right. Well, unfortunately, it's the research shows there's more sociopaths, psychopaths, narcissists in the C-suite than, they kind of cluster there.
How do they get there?
Well, I think part of it is they want it so badly, and they're often very good at managing up. And so kissing, managing up is a better way of saying kissing is a better way of saying it. And also being strategic, because what they're wanting is their own, raising up in the hierarchy, I guess. And often, really empathetic people and really people with high scores on things like conscientiousness and responsibility and empathy and things like that, or who are very integrated, they don't necessarily want to be in charge of everything. They don't want to rule the world. They want to have influence in a certain place, have work-life balance, work with a team in a really good way. They don't want to run the whole company. Seems like a pain in the ass kind of thing. So I think there's something about that. I also think that there's a misperception in certain companies that is effectiveness.
You mean taking on more and more and more and more,
or being that some of the what I would know as narcissistic qualities actually read as confidence, or and often people who are narcissists, sociopaths, and psychopaths are very charming. So sometimes you also find that people in these roles can be very good rainmakers, because they can really turn on the charm, even though working for them is hell. There's a really, really good book. It was one of my books of the year a couple of years ago, and it's by a Stanford business professor named Jeffrey Pfeffer. You probably have come across it. It's called Dying for a Paycheck.
Yeah, we've talked about it before.
We've talked about it. What he looks at is the real cost of toxic workplaces, because I think what they get there because there's a look at all the business he's bringing in or she's bringing in, without saying, look at all the people who are quitting. Look at how high our healthcare costs are. Look at how we can't seem to get anything done, for these great.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because I had a customer that we're working with, and we didn't actually get to do culture work with them. And it's good because they're very toxic, but they have exorbitant amount of people getting diabetes and hypertension and obesity. And they are very, very busy, but people can't seem to get things done. It's like so obvious to the outside eye looking in, but not obvious to the inside people.
Wow. There's one of the people that I follow is a guy who looks at the mind, body,8 connection and health, is a guy named Mario Martinez. You're familiar with him. And he did some work around diabetes. He found a connection with diabetes specifically to suppressed anger. So that'd be the first, and also hypertension, heart things are also tend to be related to anger. And this isn't woo-woo. This isn't like mystical. This is, you can plot out. I can't do it because I'm not a psychoneuroimmunologist, but I've heard him do it. It's like, if you plot it all out, you can see why this sort of like suppressing anger has this kind of effect on the system that regulates insulin. And therefore, for certain people, probably who have other factors, you get diabetes. I do not mean to say everybody with diabetes has an anger problem, but he found some correlation there. And when you're looking at it as being rampant in an organization, that would be my suspicion.
Well, and what it seems like is that when you go back to the C-suite, that there's rewards from the board for bringing in all this business and bringing in all these projects, but yet when it comes to people only have so much capacity, and not everybody wants to dive for a paycheck. I mean, one of the things that keen alignment that I believe in is everybody should be paid full-time and work part-time. If we've got the money, people should be working 32 hours a week and loving their life, because they'll bring way more to the table when they're happy and fulfilled. So we have to wrap up in a minute.
Yeah. Can I just say one thing about that, Maji? Because I think, when I look at work, I've never calculated how many hours a week I work, but I don't think I work a 40-hour week, and I run a $500,000 company, co-run that. So, it's not nothing going on here, but I think I probably work about 32 hours a week. It's very spread out, and I am so incredibly productive. And, and it's probably spread out over the course of the year. There might be weeks I work 60, but I don't think 40 is necessary because my brain is usually really fresh.
Yes. Well, and what the last thing I want to say is I follow Joe Dispenza, and I know he's becoming very, very popular, but he's also connecting the brain and brain coherence with heart math and heart coherence and alignment. And there's just so much data right now about dis-ease. And now I'm getting blurry because I'm moving too much. I don't know why that's happening. Dis-ease and disease. Yeah. And so in hindsight, what advice would you give to people who want to experience liberation at work beyond the go quit your job and be a self-employed coach?
Beyond that. We can't all do that, although there's certainly a need. I would say be an advocate in your organization for real effectiveness and look at, for example, the research on stress, because there's a point at which the diminishing return is probably around 32 to 38 hours a week, where what's happening is you're not getting any better work out of people because and there are some exceptions to that, but I would say you want to look at how do you have a workplace where people are stimulated and rewarded and challenged, but not overstressed. And then what you're going to get is you're going to get the best capacity of their brain, and be an advocate for that in your organization. And if you cannot find that in your organization, go find an organization that understands that. Don't sell your life.
There are many, many female-run organizations that are taking a stand for mental health and emotional health and physical health and more effectiveness. And there are some male organizations too, but the women are taking the lead on this for sure. Thank you, Ann Betz of BEabove Leadership.
Thank you.
We will have her logo and everything. You can find her. Really appreciate it. Thank you for being a great.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure. Bye.